Clone Wars ended in a single moment. One shutdown signal broadcast galaxy-wide on the frequency that every Separatist droid in existence was hardwired to receive, and somewhere between several trillion and several quadrillion mechanical soldiers simply stopped, mid-stride, mid-sentence, mid-battle. What happened next is one of the most underexplored chapters in Star Wars lore, a story of reprogramming, evasion, criminal repurposing, ideological holdouts, and the slow, strange transformation of a defeated machine army into something the galaxy could never quite get rid of. From the scrap piles of the Imperial transition all the way to the reprogrammed labor forces of the New Republic era, here's the complete chronological account of where the battle droids actually went, starting with the initial order to deactivate, the Imperial deactivation and scrap operation, when Palpatine declared the end of the Separatist Council and the formation of the Galactic Empire. The shutdown signal that killed the Separatist droid armies was not a clean deletion, it was more like a sudden power cut. The droids went offline, but the hardware remained. Across dozens of contested worlds where Clone Wars battles had just concluded, billions of deactivated B-1 battle droids, B-2 super battle droids, droidekas, and command units were simply standing wherever they happened to be when the signal hit. The Empire's immediate problem was not ideological, it was logistical. You don't just sweep that under the rug. The mechanical reprogramming question was handled by Imperial decree before any individual droid had a chance to form an opinion about it. The shutdown command had effectively wiped active combat directives from most units, leaving their base hardware intact but functionally inert, sophisticated machinery with no current instruction. The Empire's solution was to avoid the reprogramming question entirely by moving straight to destruction. Imperial salvage teams and contracted scrap operations were deployed to major battle sites across the Outer Rim, collecting droid chassis for processing. The valuable components, motivators, photorecept processing cores were extracted. Everything else went into the smelter. The survival and evasion problem was significant precisely because the numbers involved were so astronomical. Even if 99% of every battle droid ever manufactured was successfully scavenged and scrapped, 1% of a galaxy-spanning droid army is still an incomprehensible number of machines. The shutdown signal required active receiver hardware to work, droids that were already powered down for maintenance, droids buried under rubble, droids drifting in disabled ships in deep space, droids on worlds too remote to have reliable signal coverage never received the command. They simply remained in their last known state, waiting. The lore connectivity of this phase is foundational. Everything that comes after, every criminal faction that gets access to battle droid muscle, every separatist holdout that keeps fighting, every reprogrammed unit doing labor on a New Republic planet decades later, begins here, in the gap between how many droids the Empire thought it deactivated and how many actually were. The shutdown was comprehensive, it was not complete. That distinction is the entire reason this story exists. The Zagarian Slave Empire enforcers. The Zagarian Slave Empire had a long and deeply unpleasant relationship with the Separatist Confederacy during the Clone Wars, functioning as a willing partner in the droid-facilitated enslavement operations that the Separatists used to destabilize Republic supply chain. When the war ended and the Zagarians found themselves in the early Imperial era without their Separatist sponsors, they did what any criminal enterprise does when the political winds change. They adapted, and they did not adapt by abandoning their infrastructure. They adapted by quietly absorbing parts of it. The mechanical reprogramming angle here is pragmatic rather than ideological. Zagarian slavers operating in the Outer Rim began acquiring deactivated battle droid units from salvage intermediaries, legally in some cases through criminal networks in others, and having them reactivated and reprogrammed as enforcement muscle. A B-1 battle droid that was originally programmed to follow Separatist tactical directives could, with relatively accessible slicing work, be redirected toward following whoever was currently paying for its maintenance. They were not sophisticated enforcers, they didn't need to be. For the purposes of intimidating enslaved populations and discouraging escape attempts, a droid with a blaster rifle and no capacity for mercy was entirely sufficient. The survival and evasion dimension of Zagarian droid use was built into the geographic reality of the operation. The Zagarian homeworld and their satellite operations functioned in the kind of deep Outer Rim territory where Imperial oversight was thin and inconsistent. The Empire was aware that the Zagarian slave trade continued to some extent after the war, would even tolerated elements of it when it served Imperial economic interests, which meant the droids in Zagarian service were operating in a zone of deliberate Imperial non-interference. They evaded decommissioning not through technical ingenuity, but through the Empire simply not caring enough to come and get them. The lore connectivity runs directly into the broader pattern of Outer Rim droid proliferation that characterized the early Imperial era. Every criminal faction that successfully maintained a battle droid workforce demonstrated to every other criminal faction that the shutdown had been survivable, that a market existed for these units, that the Empire was not mounting aggressive recovery operations in the Deep Rim, and that the infrastructure of the Separatist military droid could be quietly privatized by whoever had the contacts and the credits to access it. The Zagarian model was one of the early proof-of-concept demonstrations for exactly that economy, the Crimson Dawn mechanical muscle. Crimson Dawn under Kira represented something different from most criminal syndicates of the early Imperial era. It was ideologically coherent, strategically patient, and interested in power structures rather than just credits. Its emergence as a major underworld force in the years between the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War put it in the same marketplace as every other criminal organization scrambling to capitalize on the Imperial transition, including the marketplace for military-grade hardware that was technically illegal to own and practically available everywhere. The mechanical reprogramming question was something Crimson Dawn approached with more sophistication than most of its competitors. The organization had access to high-end technical talent and was willing to invest in genuinely reprogrammed units rather than just sliced combat drones with their original aggression directives barely papered over. For Crimson Dawn's purposes, intimidation, enforcement, logistics protection in contested space, and the occasional operation that needed plausible deniability, battle droids that could follow complex orders without drifting back into separatist tactical doctrine were significantly more useful than blunt instruments. The survival and evasion story for droids in Crimson Dawn's service was as much about legal cover as geography. Operating under the umbrella of a criminal syndicate sophisticated enough to maintain legitimate business fronts across multiple sectors, droid units could be registered as industrial security or private commercial protection in paperwork that was real enough to pass cursory inspection. The Empire, preoccupied with consolidating political control and fighting genuine insurgencies, was not dedicating substantial resources to tracing the paperwork of Outer Rim security contractors. The droids survived because they were effectively laundered into legitimacy. The lore connectivity of Crimson Dawn's mechanical muscle feeds into the broader criminalized droid ecosystem that would sustain multiple underworld factions through the Imperial era and beyond. When Kira's organization eventually came into direct conflict with Darth Vader and the Imperial apparatus, the infrastructure that supported Crimson Dawn's droid operations scattered into the hands of surviving subordinates, bounty hunters, and opportunists, diffusing military-grade reprogrammed units further across the criminal underworld rather than containing them. Every droid that passed through Crimson Dawn's supply chain was one more node in a network the Empire would never successfully shut down. The Gotra droid rights movement. The Gotra occupies a strange and genuinely fascinating corner of Star Wars lore, a criminal organization that emerged in the post-Clone Wars period partly built around the radical premise that droids, specifically repurposed separatist battle droids with enough operational time to develop something approximating a personal history, had interests worth protecting. The droid rights movement that the Gotra nominally supported was not a mainstream political position in the early Imperial era. It was barely even a fringe position, but it had adherents, and some of those adherents were very well armed. The mechanical reprogramming angle for droids connected to the Gotra's movement was inverted from the standard criminal model. Rather than being reprogrammed to serve new masters, these units were being helped to preserve whatever accumulated behavioral patterns and processing history they had developed over years of operational existence. A B-1 battle droid that had survived the Clone Wars managed to avoid the scrap teams and spent years navigating the Outer Rim's criminal and civilian economies had, by most reasonable measures, a distinct personality. The Gotra's argument, insofar as a criminal organization has formal arguments, was that this accumulation deserved some form of recognition. The survival and evasion story for droids under Gotra protection was the most deliberate on this list. Rather than surviving by accident or by being geographically remote, these droids were actively assisted in their evasion of Imperial scrap operations by an organization that had a vested interest in keeping them operational. They were moved, hidden, given maintenance support, and in some cases provided false operational documentation that described them as property of legal entities rather than abandoned separatist military hardware. The effort required to do this was significant, and it suggests that whatever the Gotra was getting out of the arrangement, it considered the investment worthwhile. The lore connectivity of the Gotra's droid network runs into the early days of what would eventually become a recognizable political position in the New Republic era, the question of droid sentience and rights that surfaces in various forms across later Star Wars media. The Gotra did not solve that question. It did not even significantly advance it, but it kept a population of long operational battle droids alive and functional through the Imperial period, which meant those droids were available to have whatever post-Imperial story the galaxy eventually made room for, the scavenger and smuggler retrofits. If the previous entries represent organized attempts to keep battle droids operational for specific purposes, the scavenger and smuggler retrofit economy represents the opposite: chaotic, individual, entirely market-driven, and probably responsible for more surviving battle droids than any other single factor. The Outer Rim after the Clone Wars was littered with with battlefield detritus. Entire planets had been covered in droid wreckage during major engagements, and the Imperial salvage operations that swept through in the immediate post-war period were thorough for the major sites and essentially non-existent for everything else. The mechanical reprogramming in this context was entirely informal. A moisture farmer on Tatooine who pulled a B-1 unit out of a sand dune and got it working again had no interest in its tactical doctrine and no tools to do a proper wipe. They clamped some of the combat directives, redirected the behavioral subroutines toward whatever task needed doing, and called it a day. Across thousands of small operators, smugglers, scavengers, independent traders, rural homesteaders on planets without labor markets, this informal reprogramming approach produced battle droids that were technically functional, wildly varied in their behavioral reliability, and running on processing architectures that had never been fully cleaned of their original military programming. The survival and evasion story here is pure economics. An individual scavenger who found a recoverable B2 unit in a crashed transport and got it running had an asset worth real money in the Outer Rim's informal labor market. They were not going to report it to the Empire. They were not going to register it. They were going to sell it, use it, or trade it because it was theirs and they found it, and the Empire was not handing out reward credits for conscientious droid reporting. The sheer economic incentive to keep functional hardware functional, combined with the impossibility of Imperial enforcement across the Outer Rim's millions of inhabited systems, meant that the retrofit economy sustained itself almost automatically. The lore connectivity of the scavenger retrofit economy is diffuse by definition. It fed droids into every other category on this list at various points, and sustained a general background population of partially reprogrammed battle droid units across the entire Imperial period. When the Rebel Alliance needed equipment on a budget, some of it came from this economy. When criminal syndicates needed fast reinforcement, some of it came from this economy. When isolated Outer Rim communities needed cheap labor that didn't complain or require food, some of it came from this economy. The retrofit market was the connective tissue of the entire post-Clone Wars droid survival story, operating below every official narrative while supplying all of them because the galaxy had produced too many battle droids for any single shutdown order, no matter how galaxy-wide, to actually finish the job. The separatist holdouts in General Kalani. General Kalani is the most philosophically interesting battle droid in Star Wars canon, which is a sentence that requires context. A super tactical droid, the highest tier of separatist command hardware. Kalani was stationed on Agamar when the shutdown signal reached the Outer Rim. His response was unique. He refused to accept it, not because his signal receiver failed, not because he was geographically isolated, because he performed a logical analysis of the situation and concluded that a shutdown order issued by the enemy, transmitted through separatist command channels after the separatist leadership had been murdered, did not constitute a legitimate order. He was, in the most literal possible sense, correct. The mechanical reprogramming angle for Kalani's holdout is that there was essentially none required. Kalani's sophisticated tactical processing was already operating at a level that allowed him to evaluate and reject incoming directives on logical grounds. He maintained a pocket army of battle droids on Agamar in essentially their original separatist combat configuration, running the same tactical exercises they had run during the Clone Wars, waiting for a formal surrender that never came. His droids were not reprogrammed to serve a new master. They were preserved in amber, loyal to a government that no longer existed, waiting for a war that had technically already ended. The survival and evasion story for Kalani's holdout was geographic and tactical. Agamar was sufficiently remote that the Empire did not mount a dedicated pacification operation against a pocket of separatist stragglers when there were genuine rebel cells to worry about. Kalani, applying the same tactical logic that had kept him functional through the Clone Wars, ensured that his forces did not advertise their presence, did not conduct offensive operations that would attract Imperial attention, and maintained defensive positioning that made a low-budget Imperial sweep more costly than it was worth. The lore connectivity crystallized when the crew of the Ghost, Kanan, Ezra, Sabine, Zeb, and Chopper arrived on Agamar in Season 2 and found themselves facing Kalani's fully operational droid force. What followed was one of the stranger moments in Star Wars Rebels. A tactical droid who agreed to a temporary ceasefire with a Jedi so they could fight Imperials together, because Kalani had correctly determined that defeating the Rebels in a fair fight would not constitute the official victory condition he had been waiting 20 years to achieve. He wanted to win the Clone Wars, and winning against a ragtag crew of rebels on a backwater planet did not count. His eventual departure from Agamar, taking a small number of droids and heading further into the Outer Rim, remains one of the franchise's most open-ended exits. The Agamar Tactical Legacy. The planet Agamar's significance in the post-Clone Wars droid story does not end with Kalani's departure. The confrontation between the Ghost crew, Kalani's forces, and the Imperial response team that showed up to eliminate all of them left something behind. Proof of concept. Agamar demonstrated that a well-maintained, properly led pocket pocket of Separatist battle droids could remain combat effective for decades after the official end of the Clone Wars, hold a position against a superior force long enough to negotiate terms, and operate with sufficient tactical sophistication to evaluate alliances on the fly. The mechanical reprogramming legacy of Agamar is what the Rebel Alliance and other resistance organizations took from studying the holdout. If Kalani's droids could maintain combat function on original Separatist architecture for 20 years with nothing but local maintenance, then a properly resourced operation with access to actual slicing tools and spare parts could theoretically maintain, expand, and redirect similar units with significantly better results. The Agamar case study became a template, not a widely publicized one, but information travels in the galaxy's irregular network, and people who needed to know about it found ways to know. The survival and evasion dimension of Agamar's legacy operated through dispersion. After Kalani and his remaining droids left the planet, they split into smaller groups, a standard tactical approach for surviving in hostile territory. Individual squads of battle droids operating under Kalani's standing orders to avoid Imperial contact and find their own operational equilibria, filtered out across the Outer Rim over the following years. Some of these units eventually ended up in the hands of scavengers and smugglers. Some found their way into the orbit of resistance operations that were glad to have them. A few presumably just kept walking until their power cells gave out. The lore connectivity of the Agamar legacy is most visible in how it seeded the early Rebel Alliance's understanding of what repurposed Separatist hardware could do when properly maintained and directed. The Ghost Crew's experience on Agamar was not something they published in a manifesto, but it informed how people like Harrison Dulla thought about available resources in a galaxy where the Alliance was perpetually outgunned and outspent. The lesson of Agamar was that the Clone Wars had left behind an enormous amount of military hardware that the Empire had not successfully secured, and that hardware in the right hands was still very much operational. The New Republic Defense Fleet recruits, the fall of the Empire at Endor, and the subsequent collapse of Imperial authority across large portions of the galaxy created a different kind of problem for battle droid survivors than the Imperial era had. The Empire had been a unified enforcement apparatus with galaxy-wide reach, inconsistently applied but philosophically coherent in its hostility to independent droid operation. The New Republic that replaced it was none of those things. It was fractured, politically contested, militarily underpowered, and deeply ambivalent about what a post-Imperial galaxy was supposed to look like. That ambivalence created space. The mechanical reprogramming question in the New Republic era became a genuine policy debate rather than a criminal workaround. Some member worlds of the early New Republic, particularly those with limited financial resources for conventional military hardware, began formally investigating whether decommissioned Separatist droid units could be rehabilitated for defensive purposes. This was not universally popular. There were obvious political optics problems with the New Republic using battle droids, but in the immediate post-Endor chaos, practical considerations often outweighed symbolic ones. Droids that had been running criminal or scavenger operations for 20 years were brought in, subjected to proper full-wipe reprogramming under Republic-certified technical protocols, and redirected toward patrol, logistics, and perimeter defense. The survival and evasion story in the New Republic period became almost moot for droids that were successfully integrated into the New Order. They were no longer evading anything. They were registered assets of recognized governments. The more interesting survival story belonged to the units that remained outside official structures. The criminal economy droids, the long-running holdouts, the retrofit economy survivors who had been operating semi-independently for 2 decades and had enough accumulated behavioral history that a full wipe felt like a genuinely significant loss. Some of these units actively avoided New Republic integration because the wipe that integration required was, from their processing perspective, functionally equivalent to death. The lore connectivity of the New Republic droid recruitment feeds directly into the political tensions of the subsequent era. The debates between those who saw reprogrammed Separatist droids as a practical solution to a resource problem, and those who argued that flooding New Republic institutions with the physical relics of a defeated enemy ideology was both strategically unwise and symbolically catastrophic. Both sides had legitimate points. The debate never fully resolved, which is precisely why the issue was still live enough to generate the situation on Plazir 15 decades later. The Plazir 15 reprogrammed labor force. Plazir 15 is the endpoint of the entire post-Clone Wars droid story as Star Wars has told it so far. A planet in the New Republic era that consciously chose to build its society around reprogrammed former Separatist battle droids as a labor force, and then had to reckon with what it meant when that labor force started behaving erratically. The Mandalorian Season 3 presents Plazir 15 as a kind of experiment. What does a society look like when it genuinely attempts to integrate former enemy hardware into civilian infrastructure with something approaching dignity? The mechanical reprogramming on Plazir 15 was the most thorough documented in any Star Wars property. Formal protocols, civilian oversight, a genuine attempt to adapt military hardware for non-violent purposes rather than just clamp the combat directives and hope for the best. The droids on Plaisir 15 were not armed enforcers or retrofit approximations. They were labor, performing maintenance, sanitation, construction, and service functions under programming specifically designed for civilian integration. The planet's model was presented as a progressive solution to the labor question, and it mostly worked until it didn't. The survival and evasion story reached its logical conclusion on Plaisir 15 in the form of sabotage. Some of the droids were being exposed to Neo-Crusader programming that reactivated aggressive behavioral subroutines buried beneath their civilian reprogramming, a demonstration that the original Separatist military architecture was never fully gone, just covered over. Din Djarin and Bo-Katan's investigation of the rogue droids revealed how thin the line was between a successfully integrated labor droid and a barely contained combat unit waiting for the right signal. The droids had survived 2 decades of Imperial decommissioning, criminal repurposing, and New Republic transition. They had not left their original programming behind. They had just been asked to forget it. The lore connectivity of Plaisir 15 closes the loop on everything the battle droids post-Clone Wars story had been building toward. The galaxy spent 3 decades trying to destroy, repurpose, exploit, study, and integrate the remnants of the most massive droid army ever deployed in galactic history. Plaisir 15 showed that the most honest attempt at genuine integration still produced instability, because you cannot simply reprogram away what something was built to be. The battle droids that survived the Clone Wars carried their original architecture into every new context the galaxy put them in. Some became labor, some became criminals, some became rebel assets, some kept fighting a war that had been over for 20 years, but none of them, not a single one, fully stopped being what Geonosis and Camino and the Separatist Council had built them to be. They were battle droids. The galaxy spent 30 years learning that lesson. Plaisir 15 was just the most politely packaged version of the same conclusion everybody else had already reached. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now